The room was silent, but it wasn't the kind of silence that brings comfort. It was heavy, thick, almost suffocating. Every chair creaked under the tension. Every slight cough echoed like a gunshot. And at the center of it all sat Romy, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the crisp pages of her father's final will. The words she was about to read were going to shatter the lives of everyone in that room, but no one could have predicted just how deep the fissures would run. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Nick and Tracy are to receive nothing. Their actions have proven disloyal, deceptive, and dangerous. The sentence landed like a hammer blow. For a moment, the room seemed to stop breathing. Eyes widened, jaws tightened, and the air seemed to vibrate with disbelief. How could a father, a man known for his strong presence and unwavering authority, choose to erase the children he raised from his final testament? Was it betrayal? Was it premonition? Or something darker? You might be wondering, why would a father take such drastic measures? What could his children have done to provoke a response so severe that their names wouldn't even appear in the will, let alone inherit a single asset? And yet, as shocking as these words are, they are only the tip of the iceberg. The truth behind the disinheritance, the timing, and the events leading up to this fateful reading reveal a story so tangled in deceit, tension, and hidden dangers that it reads more like a thriller than reality. Let's step back and picture the scene. The reading took place in a well-appointed study, walls lined with books that smelled of aged paper and varnish, each volume a silent witness to decades of family history. The sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching particles of dust in the air, almost as if nature itself was pausing to observe. Romy's father had left explicit instructions. The will must be read in private, with all adult children present, no one else allowed. It was a commandment, not a suggestion, and the lawyer officiating the reading followed it with meticulous precision. Nick and Tracy sat across from her, not side by side, but separated by the polished mahogany table, as though some invisible barrier had already been drawn between them. Their faces betrayed apprehension, a mix of anger and fear that they tried, and failed, to hide. Nick, the eldest, seemed to shrink into his chair, a man who had always carried confidence like armor, now stripped of it. Tracy, on the other hand, was quiet, her eyes darting toward Romy with a question that had no words. How could this be happening? What did she miss? But Romy herself wasn't immune to the gravity of the moment. Her hands shook slightly, and her voice wavered as she cleared her throat and began reading aloud. Every word she spoke seemed to resonate beyond the walls of the study, each syllable a hammer pounding the nails of a coffin on the illusion of family unity. The first few lines were procedural, listing assets, properties, and minor bequests, legal formalities. But then came the line that would change everything, the disinheritance clause. It is at this point that most stories would pause, that most videos would summarize. But not here, not now. Because what makes this moment truly unforgettable is not just the disinheritance. It's the reason given. Disloyal, deceptive, and dangerous. These aren't words you find casually in a legal document. These are accusations, written in ink and sealed by a signature, direct from a man who had lived alongside these children, taught them, guided them, and ultimately judged them. What does disloyal really mean in this context? What about deceptive and dangerous? The words invite questions that twist like a spiral into deeper uncertainty. Was this about betrayal in business, personal relationships, or something so private, so catastrophic, that even the rest of the family had been unaware until this reading? The tension builds because, as viewers, we know that when a father issues such a statement, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. There is a story behind every word. And the timing, is critical. Only weeks before this reading, an incident occurred that would later be linked to suspicion and fear within the household. The details are murky, whispered about, but never fully explained. Was it a confrontation, a heated argument, or perhaps a more calculated maneuver to expose hidden betrayals? Whatever it was, the incident set the stage for the reading. The will was not simply a financial document. It was a message, a final verdict on decades of intertwined relationships, secrecy, and conflict. Imagine the perspective of each person in the room. Romy, holding the will, knows the power of the words she is about to utter. She has witnessed subtle signs of unrest, noticed tensions that no one else admitted to seeing. She understands the responsibility of being the messenger and the weight of revealing secrets that were intended to stay hidden until death. Her role is pivotal. Without her, the family might never have confronted what lay beneath the surface. Nick's reaction is immediate but internal. He clenches his fists, forcing himself to remain composed, but the flicker of panic in his eyes betrays him. This is more than shock. It is the realization that his father's judgment is absolute, irrevocable. Every decision he thought he had control over suddenly feels meaningless. The inheritance he anticipated, the approval he sought, the relationship he thought secure. All gone. Tracy, quieter but no less affected, processes the words differently. Her mind races, connecting dots, recalling past moments that might have seemed insignificant at the time, but now carry a new weight. She had always been observant, calculating, and careful, yet even she did not foresee this outcome. The shock is paired with a sense of betrayal, a recognition that actions once dismissed as minor infractions are now codified in a legal document, immortalized as evidence of disloyalty. As the reading progresses, it becomes clear that the will is structured not merely to divide property, but to reveal truths. Each section is layered with meaning, subtle accusations hidden beneath formal language, deliberate phrasing designed to communicate a judgment that transcends money. It is a final narrative, a father's last statement to ensure that the world understands his perspective and that his children comprehend the consequences of their choices. For the audience watching, either in person or through a screen, the tension is almost unbearable. We are compelled to ask ourselves, what could possibly justify such a strong declaration? How often does a will go beyond logistics and become a tool of revelation and confrontation? The story begs questions that keep us on edge, each unanswered moment a hook designed to hold attention, each revelation a lure deeper into the unfolding drama. And yet, despite the gravity, there is a cruel irony. The very act of disinheritance, the public reading, and the deliberate phrasing suggest that the father did not intend to punish quietly. He intended the moment to be witnessed, to resonate, to shock. The very architecture of the reading, the choice of room, the presence of all children, the controlled pace of disclosure, amplifies the emotional impact. It is not merely a transfer of assets. It is a calculated performance, a confrontation designed to leave a permanent mark. By the time the final sentences are read, the room feels suspended in time. A clock ticks somewhere, unnoticed, as if even time is reluctant to move past the revelation. Romy sets the papers down slowly, and in that pause, the full weight of the words sinks in. The disinherited children are forced to reckon with a truth that cannot be undone. The narrative of loyalty, deception, and danger is no longer abstract. It is written, official, and unalterable. But even in this moment of complete disruption, the story is far from over. The will is only the beginning. The ramifications will ripple through relationships, ignite arguments, and surface hidden resentments. The family dynamic, already fragile, will fracture in ways that no one anticipates. And as shocking as the revelation is, there are hints within the text of the will that suggest even more secrets remain. Secrets that will not be revealed until the next chapter, until the next confrontation, until the next shocking discovery. So, as we sit with this moment, the tremor of a gavel and words, the silent cries of a family in upheaval, we must ask ourselves, what comes next? How will Nick and Tracy respond to the verdict imposed not by a court, but by their own father, articulated in his final testament? And what role will Romy play in the unfolding drama, as the bearer of truth, as witness, and perhaps as the last person standing between revelation and catastrophe? The answer is not yet clear. The will has been read, the words are out, and the damage is done, but the story is just beginning. And the most disturbing part of the will, the line that promises to unravel everything we think we know about this family, is yet to come. It is here, at this precarious precipice, that we leave our introduction. The stage has been set, the players assembled, and the first act of this family drama concluded. But what comes next will change everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment Romy first entered the study, she felt an almost tangible shift in the air. The walls seemed to press in, the polished wood gleamed under sunlight that barely filtered through the heavy drapes, and the silence was so dense that each footstep echoed like a warning. She paused at the doorway, noticing the tension in Nick and Tracy even before the lawyer spoke a word. The room wasn't just a study. It was a stage, perfectly set for a confrontation that would redefine the family forever. She walked slowly toward the center, her eyes flicking to the surrounding bookshelves. These weren't just volumes of fiction or memoirs. Each was a chronicle of authority, intellect, and the legacy her father had meticulously built. And now, these silent witnesses would observe the collapse of the very relationships that gave them meaning. Romy's heart raced, but she forced herself to steady her breathing. She had been entrusted with something that carried the weight of final judgment, a role she hadn't asked for, but one that fate had placed squarely in her hands. Nick sat stiffly, his posture betraying both defiance and fear. He was the eldest, the one who had always been seen as the natural heir, the child who could do no wrong in the eyes of the family. But there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a crack in the armor he wore so confidently in public. His fingers tapped lightly against the arm of his chair, a rhythmic pattern that hinted at both anticipation and dread. Every glance he cast at Romy was measured, calculated, as if trying to predict what she would reveal before she even spoke. Tracy, on the other hand, was quieter, almost ghost-like. She seemed to occupy less space in the room, her presence deliberate but restrained. Her eyes were fixed on Romy, scanning for every micro-expression, every slight hesitation, every sign of emotion that might betray what the will contained. Unlike Nick, whose reactions were immediate and visceral, Tracy processed everything in silence, letting her mind race through possibilities and contingencies. She had always been strategic, a careful observer, but even she could not anticipate the force of the words about to be spoken. The lawyer cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to punctuate the tension rather than alleviate it. "We will now proceed with the reading of Mr. Reiner's last will and testament," he said. The words were formal, precise, yet they carried a weight that anchored the room in a suspended state. Romy felt the page tremble slightly in her hands as she unfolded the document, aware that each line she read would shape not only the inheritance of the family, but their understanding of one another. The beginning of the reading was procedural. Properties were listed, bank accounts itemized, minor bequests distributed with meticulous attention. There was an almost hypnotic rhythm to the reading, a cadence that drew the listeners into a false sense of normalcy. Each line seemed mundane, expected, even comforting, until the moment the script deviated, until the words she had anticipated diverged sharply from the story of wealth and routine. Then came the line that would shift everything. Romy's voice wavered slightly as she read aloud. "Nick and Tracy are to receive nothing. Their actions have proven disloyal, deceptive, and dangerous." The room froze. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity. Nick's hand stopped its nervous tapping. Tracy's gaze sharpened, her mind whirling to grasp the implications of these words. The accusation wasn't subtle, it wasn't indirect, and it certainly wasn't negotiable. The father who had once been a symbol of unwavering authority had rendered judgment that was absolute and unequivocal. For Romy, the weight of the moment was almost unbearable. She had anticipated shock, yes, but the intensity of the room, the tension pressing on her chest, was unlike anything she had expected. Every muscle in her body seemed to scream in protest as she continued, her voice now steady, but the tremor in her hands betrayed the magnitude of what she was delivering. She wasn't just reading a legal document. She was revealing the final verdict on decades of loyalty, secrecy, and complex family dynamics. Nick's reaction was immediate and telling. He leaned back in his chair, jaw tight, eyes narrowing as if the words could somehow be fought off, erased, or deflected. But deep down, he knew the authority of a father's will was absolute. There would be no debate, no appeal, and no second chance. The disinheritance was not merely about money. It was about judgment, about reputation, about the legacy he would inherit or, in this case, be denied. Tracy's reaction was quieter, but no less significant. Her lips pressed together in a thin line as she processed the accusation. There was anger, yes, but also disbelief. How could actions she considered minor or excusable be interpreted as betrayal? How could the carefully constructed image of loyalty and family unity be so completely dismantled in a single sentence? She knew, with a chilling certainty, that the will was only the beginning. There were layers yet to uncover, consequences yet to manifest. The lawyer's presence added another layer of gravity. He watched the reactions closely, aware that every expression, every pause, every micromovement carried meaning beyond the legal context. His voice, measured and calm, guided the reading, but even he could sense the undercurrent of tension that threatened to spill over. Each word Romy spoke seemed to vibrate in the air, magnifying the emotions already roiling beneath the surface. Romy, however, could not falter. She had been given a responsibility that required composure, insight, and, above all, courage. She understood the significance of the moment, that the words she uttered would become part of the family's history. Each syllable was a thread in a tapestry of judgment, and she was the one weaving it, guiding it, revealing it to all who needed to see it. Her role was pivotal, not passive. She was the lens through which the family would confront truth, and the mirror reflecting their actions, choices, and consequences. As the reading progressed, the tension only deepened. The words of the will were not merely administrative, they were revelatory. Each clause, each stipulation, carried subtle implications, hints of past transgressions, veiled accusations, and warnings carefully embedded in legal language. It became clear that the will was more than a document of inheritance. It was a confession, a judgment, and a narrative, crafted with precision and designed to leave an indelible mark. Nick's thoughts raced. He replayed interactions, decisions, and moments he had long since dismissed. Could any of these have contributed to this moment? Was it possible that actions he considered trivial, even justified, had been interpreted in a far graver light? The disinheritance was a puzzle, a verdict with consequences extending beyond finance. It struck at the very core of identity, of trust, and of perceived loyalty within the family. Tracy, meanwhile, began to connect dots that had previously seemed unrelated. Conversations, silences, minor disputes, all now carried new weight. The careful calculations she had made in her mind, the strategies she had employed to navigate family dynamics, suddenly seemed inadequate. The will had reframed reality, turning minor choices into major offenses, private actions into public consequences. And Romy? She felt both power and dread. She held the authority of the words, yet she also bore the burden of delivering them. Each line read aloud was a decision, a judgment rendered through voice and presence. She could not soften the blows, could not interject opinion or context. She was the medium, the conduit through which final judgment flowed. The room, still and heavy with anticipation, seemed to vibrate with unspoken questions. How had it come to this? Could reconciliation be possible? What deeper truths were embedded within the will, waiting to be uncovered? The disinheritance was a shock, yes, but it was only the beginning of a narrative that would continue to unfold in ways no one in the room could yet anticipate. As the reading drew to a close, Romy's final words lingered in the air. The silence that followed was deafening, pregnant with consequences. Nick and Tracy sat frozen, the reality of their disinheritance settling like a stone in their chests. Romy placed the will gently on the table, her hands steady now, her role complete, but her mind racing with what came next. And what came next was not merely speculation. It was inevitable. The will had set in motion a series of emotional, legal, and relational consequences that would reverberate far beyond the room. Every action, every decision, every secret was now illuminated, exposed to scrutiny and judgment. The story of the family, carefully hidden behind polite appearances and private interactions, was unraveling in real time. The chapter closes here, at the edge of revelation. The first act is complete, yet the narrative is only beginning. The disinheritance has been revealed, the accusations spoken, and the stage set for the unfolding drama. But what comes next will change everything, and no one saw it coming. The very act of rewriting a will is deliberate. It is not a casual decision, nor is it taken lightly. Yet Rob had done it. Not once, not twice, but multiple times. And every revision told a story, revealing more than just the distribution of assets. Each change, each scribbled correction, and each new clause was a window into a mind wrestling with loyalty, betrayal, and foresight. But why? Why go through such painstaking efforts to reshape what would become a permanent record of judgment? To understand this, we need to step back and examine the context. Rob's life had been far from ordinary. A man of influence and means, he carried the weight of expectation, both from the world and, perhaps more profoundly, from within his family. His children had grown up under his scrutiny, each action measured, each decision observed. For decades, he had been a figure of authority, a man whose approval was sought in every corner of his household. And now, at the end of his life, he faced a choice: leave a will that simply dispersed his wealth, or one that told the unvarnished truth about loyalty, deception, and danger. The first draft of the will was largely conventional. It outlined properties, bank accounts, and minor personal bequests. Nothing controversial, nothing dramatic. It was what one might expect from any affluent patriarch: orderly, predictable, methodical. But Rob was not content with predictability. He had observed, over the years, subtle shifts in behavior among his children, secrets kept, alliances formed, decisions made behind his back. These were not merely minor family squabbles. They were patterns that hinted at deeper problems, a potential threat to the integrity of his legacy. It was the second draft that raised eyebrows among his legal team. Changes were not minor adjustments. They were targeted, precise, and, some would argue, provocative. Nick's inheritance was reduced, not eliminated, but the reasoning for any limitations was vaguely worded, almost cryptic. Tracy was included, but with clauses that suggested conditions, obligations, and the potential for revocation. These changes hinted at dissatisfaction, even judgment, but did not yet contain the explosive language that would later define the final will. Why would Rob go to such lengths? Observers who have examined similar cases suggest that rewriting a will multiple times often indicates internal conflict. The testator, here, Rob, struggles with balancing love, disappointment, and justice. He wants to protect his assets, yes, but he also wants to communicate something far deeper: a moral judgment, a declaration of consequences, a record of choices. It's a way of ensuring that his perspective, his reasoning, and his values survive him, unfiltered and undeniable. The third and final draft was different. This is the version Romy read aloud, the version that declared Nick and Tracy disinherited, citing betrayal as the reason. But what drove Rob to take such a definitive step? Conversations with close acquaintances suggest there were a series of incidents, subtle yet cumulative, that eroded his trust. Small betrayals, yes, but each amplified by context. Moments of secrecy, manipulations of family dynamics, and perhaps even calculated attempts to influence inheritance outcomes in ways he considered unethical or dangerous. And yet, the timing of the final draft is critical. It was completed just months before his death, a period marked by tension, unease, and private confrontations. Rob, by all accounts, was meticulous in documenting both his assets and his reasoning. He wanted clarity, certainty, and accountability. The final will, with its blunt language, was not an impulsive act. It was the culmination of years of observation and reflection, a document crafted to ensure that his children understood not only what they were receiving, or not receiving, but why. In addition to personal betrayal, there were other factors that influenced the rewrites. Business dealings, for instance, had become increasingly complex. Nick, who had always been considered the heir apparent, had begun making decisions that challenged the established order. Tracy, meanwhile, had developed independent financial interests that were perceived as conflicting with family values. Rob's revisions were both protective and punitive. He sought to safeguard his legacy while holding his children accountable for actions he deemed dangerous or disloyal. Friends of the family also noted a series of private conversations in which Rob hinted at his concerns. Loyalty isn't just about words, he reportedly said in one such conversation. It's about actions, consistency, and integrity. And some of them, well, I've seen enough. These conversations, though private, illuminate the mindset behind the revisions. The will was not simply a financial instrument. It was a moral and emotional statement, carefully constructed to convey judgment where words spoken in life had perhaps failed. The legal team, while bound by confidentiality, recognized the unusual nature of the final draft. They understood that a will with such explicit accusations was rare, almost unprecedented in some respects. Normally, lawyers advise against including language that could provoke disputes or emotional backlash. Yet Rob insisted. He wanted clarity, permanence, and, above all, a record of his reasoning. In his mind, the inheritance was inseparable from accountability. The wealth could be transferred, but the judgment had to be unambiguous. The rewriting process also reveals Rob's understanding of timing and control. Each draft was deliberate, spaced across months, each reflecting a different stage of his assessment of his children's character and behavior. The final version was not rushed. It was carefully timed to coincide with a period of reflection, a moment when he could fully articulate his evaluation of loyalty, deception, and danger. He was deliberate in ensuring that the language was precise, unyielding, and indelible. For Romy, the multiple drafts provide insight into her father's state of mind. She later noted that reading the final will was not merely about delivering a verdict. It was about conveying years of observation, judgment, and, perhaps most importantly, protection. Rob had rewritten the document to leave nothing ambiguous, nothing open to misinterpretation. Every word, every clause, every phrase was a message, a warning, a declaration. This leads to a critical question. Why did he choose such public transparency? Why have the reading in front of all children rather than keeping certain aspects private? The answer lies in Rob's desire to control not just the distribution of wealth, but the narrative of truth. By having Romy read the will aloud, he ensured that the reasoning, the judgment, and the consequences were witnessed directly by those most affected. It was not enough to write. He needed the revelation to be experienced, absorbed, and undeniable. Furthermore, the rewrites reveal Rob's strategic thinking. The progression from conventional bequests to conditional distributions and finally to outright disinheritance demonstrates a methodical approach to moral and practical judgment. Each revision was a test, a calibration of his assessment of trustworthiness and risk. By the time the final draft was complete, he had distilled decades of observation into a concise, unflinching statement of accountability. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of the rewriting process is what it says about his understanding of human nature. Rob knew that inheritance could be a catalyst for conflict, manipulation, and resentment. He knew that wealth could amplify existing fractures within a family. By rewriting the will multiple times, he sought to preempt misinterpretation, to assert control, and to communicate the principles he valued most: integrity, honesty, and loyalty. And yet, for all the planning and precision, there remained an element of uncertainty. Even the most carefully crafted document cannot fully dictate human reaction. Nick and Tracy, despite the clarity of the will, were unpredictable. Their emotional responses, their attempts at reconciliation or confrontation, were beyond Rob's control. The will was both shield and sword, a protective measure for his legacy, and a weapon to deliver judgment. As the final draft came into Romy's hands, the culmination of this careful orchestration was realized. She read aloud a document that was not only a distribution of assets, but also a moral statement, a family indictment, and a declaration of consequences. The room, already tense from anticipation, absorbed each word with a growing awareness that the past, the present, and the future were now inextricably linked through a single, powerful document. And so, we arrive at the cliffhanger. The question that lingers over every action, every word, every decision. What could Rob have witnessed, experienced, or suspected that prompted him to rewrite his will in such a meticulous, deliberate, and accusatory way? The answer is buried within the family's history, in moments of hidden tension, secret conversations, and choices that only now, under the weight of final judgment, come into full view. The stage is set. The will has been rewritten. The verdict is clear. But the reasons behind these decisions, the true motivations, the hidden betrayals, and the dangerous actions are waiting to be revealed. And what comes next will change everything, and no one saw it coming. He told one person, only one. The words echoed in Romy's mind as she prepared for the reading. It wasn't part of the will itself, not technically, but it was part of the story that preceded it. The warning her father had given months earlier, a private admonition delivered in confidence, a caution that was ignored or dismissed by those it concerned most. And yet, in hindsight, it carried the weight of prophecy. Rob had always been deliberate in his communication, careful to measure what he said and to whom. This was no exception. In a quiet conversation with a trusted family member, a sibling or a confidant, perhaps Romy herself, he had spoken of dangerous tendencies and actions that could not be ignored. The specifics were murky, intentionally vague, but the intent was clear. He wanted someone to be aware, to observe, to take note, and, if necessary, act. The warning was both shield and signal, a subtle instruction that carried the power to alter outcomes. But warnings only work when they are heeded. In this case, the caution went largely unacknowledged. Nick and Tracy, the subjects of his concern, did not perceive it as serious. To them, it was parental concern, perhaps an overreaction. They did not grasp the full gravity of the words, the context, or the evidence Rob had silently gathered over time. And therein lay the tragedy. The warning, as precise as it was, failed to prevent the consequences Rob so carefully anticipated. Let's examine what this warning entailed. While the details remain confidential, sources familiar with the family's dynamics describe a series of incidents, subtle but consistent, that raised red flags. Financial discrepancies, secret communications, minor manipulations, and moments of deception all built a pattern that Rob could not ignore. He saw potential danger in these actions, not only for his estate and legacy, but for the well-being of the family as a whole. The warning was his attempt to flag these behaviors before they escalated. Romy later reflected that the warning had been delivered in a calm but firm manner. Rob's demeanor was measured, almost clinical, yet the words carried unmistakable weight. Some actions have consequences that cannot be reversed, he had said, his tone brooking no argument. If ignored, they could threaten more than just wealth. They could threaten trust, safety, and family integrity. At the time, it seemed abstract, even cryptic, to those listening. But now, in the context of the will and subsequent revelations, the warning reads as chillingly prescient. The subtlety of Rob's caution is worth noting. He did not publicly shame, confront aggressively, or issue ultimatums. His approach was controlled, discreet, and calculated. By confiding in a single trusted individual, he ensured that the information would not become a source of conflict or paranoia. Yet, he also relied on human judgment to respond appropriately, to take the warning seriously, to observe and intervene if necessary. And therein lay the vulnerability. Human judgment is fallible, especially when colored by denial, arrogance, or disbelief. Consider the psychological dynamics at play. Nick and Tracy, confident in their place within the family and accustomed to their father's influence, likely underestimated the seriousness of the warning. To them, life had always followed a predictable path, guided by expectations and privileges. A warning, no matter how earnest, seemed inconsequential in the grand scheme. They did not perceive the cumulative nature of their actions, the way each decision added weight to the father's judgment. Romy, by contrast, had the benefit of observation and perspective. She could see patterns, anticipate consequences, and understand the stakes in a way that the warned parties could not. Her awareness, coupled with her presence at the will reading, positioned her as both witness and interpreter. She understood that the warning was not a casual statement, but a strategic move, a carefully placed signal meant to prevent or mitigate disaster. It is here that the story becomes most compelling. Warnings in families often go unheeded, dismissed as hyperbole or exaggeration. But when the warning comes true, when the consequences unfold exactly as predicted, the moment of recognition is seismic. The observer realizes that what was once dismissed as irrelevant or trivial had, in fact, been a guidepost, a crucial piece of foresight that could have altered outcomes if acknowledged. Rob's warning also highlights a broader theme, the intersection of authority and foresight. He recognized patterns, understood human tendencies, and anticipated potential consequences. This ability to project outcomes based on observed behavior is rare, and it speaks to both his intelligence and his vigilance. Yet even the most prescient insight cannot enforce compliance. It relies on others to act wisely, to heed signals, and to intervene. In this case, the failure to respond compounded the eventual consequences. The warning was layered, not only addressing immediate concerns, but also signaling broader moral and ethical principles. Rob had long valued integrity, transparency, and accountability within his family. His caution was not merely a protective measure for assets. It was an insistence that these values be recognized, respected, and enacted. Those who ignored the warning were, in effect, disregarding not just his instructions but the moral framework he had sought to instill. One can also interpret the warning as a psychological test. By delivering it discreetly to a single individual, Rob gauged the response, measured the attentiveness, and assessed the potential for corrective action. The reaction, or lack thereof, revealed character traits, loyalty levels, and judgment abilities. In hindsight, the warning functioned as both a shield and a litmus test, revealing who could be trusted and who might fail when stakes were highest. As the narrative unfolded, the consequences of ignoring the warning became evident. The final will, with its explicit declaration of disinheritance, reads almost as an extension of the original caution. The warning and the will are connected threads in a single tapestry, each reinforcing the other. One sets the stage, the other delivers the verdict. Together, they illustrate the meticulous planning, foresight, and moral reasoning that underpinned Rob's decisions. Consider, too, the emotional toll on Romy. As the bearer of truth, she had witnessed the warning, understood its implications, and now faced the task of revealing the final judgment. Her role was not passive, it was active, fraught with responsibility, and laden with ethical complexity. She had to balance the integrity of the document, the gravity of the accusation, and the potential emotional fallout, all while maintaining composure under the most intense scrutiny. And yet, despite all foresight and planning, there remained uncertainty. Human reactions are unpredictable, and the emotional responses of Nick and Tracy were unknown until the moment of reading. The warning had been ignored, yes, but the fallout was only fully realized in that quiet, sunlit study, as Romy's voice carried the weight of finality. The warning also invites reflection on the nature of trust and accountability. In families, especially those with wealth and influence, warnings are often ignored because of perceived loyalty, familiarity, or entitlement. Yet, when consequences align precisely with foresight, the failure to heed advice is amplified. It is not merely a mistake, it becomes a demonstration of misjudgment, denial, or even moral failing. The disinheritance, in this light, becomes not just punitive but illustrative, a demonstration of the consequences of ignoring clear guidance. So, as we close this chapter, it is worth asking, what precisely did the warning entail? Who was it delivered to? And why did the subjects fail to take it seriously? While the full details may remain obscured, the outcome is undeniable. The will, the disinheritance, and the explicit accusation of betrayal are the culmination of a chain that began with that simple, overlooked warning. And the tension remains unresolved. The warning was meant to prevent disaster, yet its neglect made the disaster inevitable. The narrative is now set in motion, and the consequences will continue to unfold in ways that none of the participants, including Romy, could have fully anticipated. The stage is prepared, the actors are in place, and the audience is left to ponder the full weight of foresight ignored and warning dismissed. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Nick had always been seen as the eldest, the natural heir, the one destined to carry forward the family name, reputation, and legacy. He had grown up under the steady gaze of his father, absorbing lessons about responsibility, expectation, and power. On the surface, he appeared confident, assertive, almost untouchable. But beneath that veneer, there were fissures, subtle cracks in character and behavior that only a careful observer, like Rob, could perceive. One of the most striking aspects of Nick's story is his physical and emotional proximity to his father. While other family members had moved away, pursued careers, or established independent lives, Nick remained close. He lived in the guest house on the estate, a constant presence just steps from his father's residence. To some, this proximity seemed comforting, even loyal, a son who valued family above all else. But Rob saw it differently. Being constantly present did not equate to loyalty. It sometimes concealed entitlement, dependence, and, ultimately, a lack of accountability. Nick's psychological profile was complex. On the one hand, he was charming, articulate, and persuasive, a son who could navigate social and family dynamics with ease. On the other, he exhibited patterns of impulsivity, subtle manipulations, and decision-making that prioritized personal gain over integrity. These traits were not extreme, certainly not criminal in the conventional sense, but within the microcosm of a family estate, they created a pattern Rob could not ignore. Consider the dynamics of codependence. Nick's constant presence in the estate was both comforting and constraining. He was available for guidance, conversation, and companionship, yet he was also exposed to scrutiny, observation, and evaluation. Every interaction, every decision, and every action could be, and often was, judged. To a casual observer, Nick's behavior might have seemed normal or even harmless. But Rob, ever watchful, recognized a recurring pattern: entitlement disguised as loyalty, manipulation disguised as care, and decision-making that consistently tilted toward self-interest. One of the critical elements of Nick's relationship with his father was his perception of authority. As the eldest son, he believed he had a natural claim to influence and inheritance. He assumed that proximity and apparent devotion would guarantee favor. Yet, the reality was more complex. Rob valued integrity above convenience, moral judgment above expectation. Nick's repeated lapses, whether in judgment, honesty, or alignment with family values, gradually eroded the trust his father had once placed in him. It is worth examining specific incidents that illustrate this pattern. Friends and acquaintances of the family describe moments where Nick made unilateral decisions, engaged in secretive behavior, or prioritized personal ambition over familial harmony. Each of these instances, individually, might have seemed minor, easily excused. But cumulatively, they painted a portrait of a son who, despite his proximity and apparent loyalty, could not be fully trusted. Rob, always observant, documented these patterns mentally, if not in writing, understanding that legacy and integrity were inseparable. The complexity of Nick's character lies in the duality of intention versus perception. From his perspective, he was fulfilling his role as the devoted eldest son. He was present, attentive, and actively involved in the management of family affairs. Yet from his father's perspective, these same behaviors revealed underlying entitlement and self-interest. This duality created tension, subtle at first, growing in intensity over time, until the final verdict, embodied in the will, could no longer be postponed or softened. Nick's presence in the estate also had a symbolic dimension. He was physically close to the center of power, yet emotionally distant from the values that Rob sought to instill. This juxtaposition heightened the father's scrutiny and underscored the disconnect between proximity and loyalty. Rob's observations were meticulous. He noted every lapse, every misstep, and every sign of moral compromise. The final will, with its explicit disinheritance, was the culmination of decades of observation, reflection, and judgment. Consider the broader psychological implications. Being the son who never left created a unique pressure. Nick had constant access to influence and oversight, but he also operated under relentless evaluation. The expectations were high, the scrutiny unyielding, and the consequences of missteps increasingly severe. This environment fostered both opportunity and vulnerability, allowing Nick to act with confidence while simultaneously exposing him to permanent judgment. The dynamic between Nick and his siblings also played a critical role. Romy and Tracy, while present, had established different relationships with their father, relationships marked by independence, discretion, and selective engagement. Nick's constant presence contrasted sharply with their distance, emphasizing both his commitment and, paradoxically, his failings. The will would later reflect this contrast, highlighting patterns of behavior and demonstrating that proximity alone does not equate to trustworthiness. Nick's repeated behaviors were subtle, yet consequential. Small acts of concealment, minor misrepresentations, or unilateral decisions accumulated into a pattern Rob could not ignore. These were not dramatic betrayals in the conventional sense, but in the context of family dynamics and the management of significant wealth, they were sufficient to warrant concern. Rob's decision to rewrite his will, culminating in the disinheritance, was both preventive and punitive, a final measure to safeguard legacy while holding his eldest son accountable for repeated lapses. Emotionally, Nick's reaction during the reading was telling. As Romy voiced the disinheritance clause, a flicker of disbelief crossed his face, quickly replaced by a mixture of panic, anger, and resignation. His confidence, cultivated over decades of familial expectation, crumbled in an instant. The reality was undeniable. Proximity, loyalty in appearance, and years of assumed entitlement could not protect him from the consequences of repeated misjudgment and perceived disloyalty. Tracy's reaction, while quieter, reinforced the dynamics at play. She observed Nick's response and recognized the patterns her father had meticulously documented. Her understanding of family behavior, coupled with her analytical mindset, allowed her to anticipate the consequences in a way Nick could not. The reading was as much a revelation to her as it was a shock to her brother, a demonstration of patterns made visible through final judgment. Romy, too, played a critical role in this dynamic. Her ability to perceive underlying motivations, connect subtle behaviors to broader patterns, and execute her father's instructions with precision positioned her as both witness and executor of judgment. She understood that Nick's constant presence had both facilitated observation and magnified his exposure to scrutiny. The will, read aloud under her guidance, crystallized the patterns Rob had long noted, transforming observation into irreversible consequence. Nick's story also illuminates a broader theme: the illusion of loyalty versus the reality of action. It is easy to appear devoted, to inhabit spaces, to maintain proximity, but true loyalty is demonstrated through integrity, honesty, and alignment with core values. Rob's meticulous observation revealed that proximity, when coupled with self-interest or entitlement, is insufficient to guarantee trust. The final verdict, explicit in its disinheritance, codified this principle, leaving no room for interpretation or appeal. Furthermore, Nick's position underscores the psychological tension inherent in family hierarchies. As the eldest, he carried expectation, privilege, and assumed authority. Yet these very attributes became sources of vulnerability, exposing him to heightened scrutiny and magnifying the consequences of missteps. The will, in this context, was not merely punitive. It was corrective, instructive, and emblematic of the broader lessons Rob sought to convey about integrity, accountability, and the responsibilities of inheritance. And so, as we consider Nick, the son who never left, we see a portrait of complexity, contradiction, and consequence. His proximity to his father, once considered an asset, became a liability. His confidence, once a shield, became a target for judgment. And his actions, interpreted through the lens of decades of observation, ultimately determined the fate prescribed in the final will. But the story does not end here. Nick's disinheritance, shocking as it was, represents only a fragment of the broader narrative. Patterns of behavior, subtle betrayals, and hidden actions continue to ripple through the family dynamic. As we move forward, the interplay between perception, judgment, and consequence will reveal layers of complexity that even Nick could not anticipate. And the question that lingers, unresolved and potent, is this: how much of his fate was determined by his actions, and how much by his father's foresight? The answer is buried in the family history, in choices made and ignored, in warnings dismissed, and in the final verdict written in ink and judgment. Tracy Reiner had always been a study in contrasts. Outwardly composed, charismatic, and seemingly unflappable, she carried herself with a calm elegance that suggested control. Yet beneath the surface lay a web of secrecy, calculated decisions, and choices that were carefully guarded from the prying eyes of even those closest to her. To those who only glimpsed the polished exterior, Tracy appeared confident, responsible, and loyal, a daughter aligned with her father's values. But those who observed more closely understood that her smile often concealed motives, strategies, and actions that would later define her role in the unfolding family drama. Tracy's relationship with her father, Rob, was multifaceted. Unlike Nick, whose proximity was both literal and symbolic, Tracy maintained a careful distance, balancing presence with autonomy. She engaged with her father, yes, but she did so selectively, demonstrating intelligence, emotional awareness, and a strategic mindset that allowed her to navigate family dynamics with precision. Her father appreciated these qualities, yet he also noted patterns of behavior that troubled him, subtle deviations from honesty and transparency that hinted at disloyalty or self-interest. One of the most significant aspects of Tracy's story is her ability to compartmentalize. She could maintain outward appearances of alignment while pursuing personal interests discreetly. This skill, while often admired, carried inherent risks. Rob, always vigilant, recognized that secrecy, even when skillfully executed, could be dangerous. It could undermine trust, create vulnerabilities, and ultimately influence the distribution of assets and judgment within the family. Consider the example of the family's financial matters. Tracy had access to resources and information, often operating behind the scenes in ways that were not immediately visible to others. She made decisions, negotiated arrangements, and managed accounts with a deft hand, all while maintaining the appearance of compliance and loyalty. To an outsider, these actions seemed unremarkable, even commendable. But to Rob, they were patterns to be evaluated, behaviors to be measured against principles of honesty, integrity, and risk to the family. Her strategic thinking extended beyond finances. Tracy had a remarkable ability to anticipate reactions, navigate complex emotional landscapes, and make calculated choices in high-pressure situations. She understood the delicate balance of family dynamics, recognizing that words, gestures, and even silences carried weight. And yet, this very skill that allowed her to operate effectively also created tension. Rob could see the potential for manipulation, the subtle ways in which actions could be misinterpreted, and the consequences of misaligned intentions. Tracy's behavior was further complicated by her awareness of her siblings. She understood Nick's proximity, his sense of entitlement, and the pattern of behavior that had increasingly concerned their father. She observed, calculated, and, in many ways, positioned herself as both participant and observer, navigating the intricate web of family hierarchy with intelligence and foresight. But even with these abilities, Tracy's actions were scrutinized, measured against the highest standard of integrity, and evaluated in the context of past and potential consequences. Her secrets were not malicious, at least not in the conventional sense. They were strategic, defensive, and designed to maintain autonomy while operating within a family environment fraught with expectations and judgment. Yet in the context of the final will, these secrets became liabilities. Rob's observations, accumulated over years, crystallized in a document that transformed perceived minor deceptions into evidence of disloyalty and danger. The very skills that had allowed Tracy to navigate the family's complexities were now being measured against a strict moral framework, one that left little room for ambiguity. Tracy's role in the events leading up to the reading of the will also illustrates a key theme: the tension between perception and reality. Outward appearances suggested calm, confidence, and loyalty. Inwardly, there were calculated decisions, hidden motives, and actions that could be interpreted as self-serving. The dissonance between these two realities created a subtle but persistent tension, one that Rob meticulously documented in his assessment and ultimately codified in the final document. Emotionally, Tracy's response to the reading was complex. While Nick's reaction was immediate and visceral, hers was reflective, analytical, and restrained. She processed the disinheritance with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and strategic consideration. The language of the will, explicit, accusatory, and final, forced her to confront a reality she may have sensed but had not fully anticipated. The accusation of disloyalty, deception, and danger was not just a judgment on behavior. It was an indictment of patterns, choices, and decisions that had remained largely hidden until the moment of revelation. Tracy's ability to compartmentalize now became both a strength and a challenge. She had to navigate the immediate emotional impact while preparing for the long-term consequences. There were questions to answer, explanations to consider, and strategies to formulate. She understood that the reading was not merely a private family event, but a moment that would shape public perception, legal proceedings, and the broader narrative surrounding the family's dynamics. The complexity of Tracy's situation is further highlighted by her position between siblings. She observed Nick's reactions, assessed his emotional and behavioral responses, and began to anticipate potential conflicts. Her awareness of family patterns allowed her to predict possible outcomes, but it also reinforced the gravity of her own situation. The disinheritance was not simply punitive. It was instructive, a reflection of her father's judgment on how secrecy, strategy, and hidden motives could be interpreted in ways that undermined trust. Tracy's secrets, in other words, were double-edged. They had allowed her to operate effectively, maintain autonomy, and navigate complex dynamics. But in the context of Rob's final judgment, they became evidence of the very behaviors he deemed disloyal, deceptive, and dangerous. The reading of the will transformed her strategic discretion into a liability, highlighting the tension between survival, strategy, and moral accountability within the family framework. Consider the psychological weight of this moment. Tracy, who had carefully managed appearances, now faced the stark reality of judgment, codified in legal language, and delivered by the sibling she trusted to convey her father's intentions accurately. The will left no room for negotiation, explanation, or mitigation. It was absolute, final, and reflective of patterns observed over years, a testament to the meticulous and often unforgiving evaluation conducted by her father. The reading also illuminates broader themes of perception, identity, and morality. Tracy's outward composure belied internal complexity, just as her strategic decisions masked underlying tensions. The disinheritance forced a reconciliation of these dualities, compelling her to confront the consequences of choices that had previously existed in the shadows. It was a moment of reckoning, one in which strategy collided with moral judgment and consequence. Her role in the family's unfolding drama does not end with the reading. Tracy's intelligence, foresight, and strategic thinking position her as a critical actor in the narrative that follows. The decisions she makes in response to this judgment, the alliances she forms, and the ways she navigates emerging conflicts will shape the family's dynamics for years to come. The reading of the will was not an endpoint, but a catalyst, a turning point that transforms observation and strategy into action and consequence. As we consider Tracy, her secrets, her strategies, and her response to judgment, it becomes clear that she embodies the tension between appearance and reality, between strategy and morality, and between autonomy and accountability. Her story illuminates the complexities of family dynamics, the weight of judgment, and the consequences of actions previously hidden from view. And yet, for all her intelligence and foresight, there remains uncertainty. How will Tracy navigate the fallout of disinheritance? Which secrets will come to light, and which will remain buried? How will her relationship with her siblings evolve under the shadow of final judgment? These questions hang in the air, unresolved and potent, driving the narrative forward. But what comes next will change everything, and no one saw it coming. The weight of the moment pressed down on Romy like a physical force. She had rehearsed this in her mind countless times, imagined the tone, the cadence, the pauses. And yet, as she held the document in her hands, it was clear that no rehearsal could prepare her for the gravity of the task. This was not merely a reading. It was the execution of a father's judgment, a moment that would forever alter family dynamics, and a confrontation with truth in its most unvarnished form. The room was silent, charged with expectation. Nick sat stiffly, his expression a mixture of defiance and anxiety. Tracy's calm exterior masked the storm of thoughts racing through her mind. Romy herself felt the tremor of responsibility. Her hands, steady on the outside, betrayed a slight quiver. Every eye in the room was fixed on her, every subtle movement magnified by the anticipation of what was to come. She began with the procedural sections of the will, the listings of properties, minor bequests, and standard allocations. The rhythm of reading created a false sense of security, a momentary lull before the revelation. Listeners leaned in, absorbed in the details, unaware that the most significant moment was imminent. Romy's voice, measured and precise, carried the weight of authority, guiding her audience through legal language that masked the emotional earthquake waiting just beyond the page. And then it came. The clause that would define the narrative, that would shock, that would irrevocably alter the lives of those seated before her. Nick and Tracy are to receive nothing. Their actions have proven disloyal, deceptive, and dangerous. The room froze. Time seemed to dilate, each second stretching into an eternity. Nick's fingers unclenched, then trembled slightly on the armrest. Tracy's lips pressed into a thin line, her mind racing to interpret the implications. Romy felt the silence settle over her like a fog, thick and suffocating, as the weight of the words reverberated through the room. Romy's voice wavered slightly, not from fear, but from the recognition of the moment's magnitude. She was delivering not just legal instructions, but moral judgment, and she understood that every syllable carried consequences that extended far beyond monetary distribution. She had become the vessel through which a father's observations, warnings, and final evaluations would be revealed to the children he had both nurtured and judged. Nick's reaction was immediate and visceral. His confidence, cultivated over decades of assumed entitlement, cracked in the face of undeniable reality. He leaned back, jaw tight, eyes narrowing as he tried to process the implications. The disinheritance was not just financial. It was symbolic, a statement about character, loyalty, and trust. Every decision he had made, every action he had taken that deviated from his father's expectations, now carried amplified weight. Tracy's response was more controlled, but no less significant. She processed the words analytically, considering both the emotional impact and the strategic consequences. Her mind raced through possible responses, potential actions, and long-term implications. She understood that the reading was a public revelation within the family context, a moment that would define her standing, her relationships, and her ability to navigate the fallout. Romy felt the gravity of her dual role, executor and witness. She was tasked with maintaining composure while conveying the absolute finality of her father's judgment. Each word she spoke reinforced the authority of the will, transforming observation and foresight into an unassailable verdict. Her presence anchored the reading, providing a conduit for truth, transparency, and moral clarity. The emotional tension in the room was palpable. Nick's disbelief was interlaced with anger and panic. Tracy's calculated restraint contrasted with the volatility of her brother. And Romy, while emotionally invested, maintained the steady hand required to deliver final judgment with precision. The interplay of these responses highlighted the complexity of family dynamics, the weight of moral accountability, and the irreversible consequences of actions previously unnoticed or dismissed.